Sometimes a government file begins with a crime, and sometimes it begins with a question no one wants to answer. The folder lay open on the steel desk inside a quiet federal office in Dallas, Texas, late autumn of 1944, its paper edges slightly curled from the dry air that rolled across the plains every year when summer finally surrendered. A single typed line sat near the top of the page, stark and almost unbelievable even to the man reading it. German prisoner of war women assigned to agricultural labor programs in Texas are reportedly expecting children. Special Agent Thomas Keene leaned back in his chair and read the line again, slower this time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more ordinary. They did not. Outside the window, the afternoon sun burned pale gold across the parking lot, and somewhere in the distance a freight train horn carried across the dry air, long and lonely. Keene had spent 15 years investigating bank fraud, smuggling, and the occasional espionage rumor that drifted up from the Gulf Coast, but nothing in his experience resembled what sat inside the thin folder before him. War created strange situations, of course. Everyone in Washington knew that by now. But this one was different. This one had a human weight to it that no regulation manual had ever explained. The next page contained a photograph clipped from a local Texas newspaper. 6 women stood behind a wire fence, their posture straight despite the heavy cotton work clothes issued by the camp. The caption beneath the photograph described them simply as German POW agricultural laborers assisting local ranch operations during the wartime labor shortage. Their faces were calm. Tired, perhaps, but calm. Keene studied them carefully, the way investigators learn to read details other people overlook. The woman in the center drew his attention first. Her name, according to the typed report attached behind the photo, was Marta Keller, 27 years old. Former hospital assistant from Bremen, captured in North Africa in early 1943 and transferred to the United States under the Geneva Convention Prisoner Relocation Program. Height 5 feet 6 inches. Weight approximately 115 pounds at intake. Hair listed as light brown, though in the photograph it looked almost blonde beneath the hard Texas sunlight. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance. Nothing dramatic or rebellious. She looked like someone who had spent most of her life following rules. That detail alone made the situation harder to understand. Keene turned another page. The report continued in the clipped language of military correspondence. Camp Redstone Agricultural Assignment Unit, located 32 miles outside Abilene, Texas. Prisoners transported daily under guard to assist local ranchers with seasonal labor tasks, including fence repair, feed preparation, and irrigation maintenance. Civilian supervisor listed as Ethan Cole, age 30, ranch foreman, lifelong Texas resident. Keene paused there. Ethan Cole. The name appeared again 2 pages later in a witness note from a postal clerk in a nearby town who had reported unusual conversations among local residents. Nothing specific. Just rumors drifting through small-town cafes where coffee cups stayed warm all morning and people talked longer than they intended. Rumors about the German women working out near the Cole Ranch. Rumors about kindness, about long conversations across language barriers, about something deeper that no one wanted to say out loud. Keene closed the folder for a moment and rubbed his eyes. War had stripped millions of people from their homes and dropped them into unfamiliar places. Soldiers from Oklahoma fought in France. Farm boys from Kansas crossed the Pacific. And now German prisoners found themselves standing under the vast sky of West Texas, surrounded by windmills and cattle instead of the gray stone towns they had once known. Under those circumstances, strange connections could grow quietly, not out of rebellion, not even out of romance the way newspapers like to describe things, but out of simple human gravity. People recognizing other people in the middle of a world that had lost its balance. Still, the situation described in the folder raised questions far beyond ordinary sympathy. Federal law restricted fraternization between prisoners and civilian workers. Military command expected strict separation, clear boundaries that preserved order inside the camps. If those lines had blurred, someone would need to understand how and why. Keene reopened the folder and studied the photograph again. Marta Keller stood slightly apart from the others, her hands folded loosely at her waist, as if she were listening to something just outside the frame. Perhaps a guard speaking. Perhaps a ranch worker explaining a task. or perhaps simply the wind moving across the prairie grass beyond the fence. Her expression was steady, not defiant, not afraid, just composed in a way that suggested. She carried her dignity carefully, like a fragile object that must never be dropped. Keene had seen that look before in refugee camps along the East Coast when European civilians arrived after dangerous Atlantic crossings. People who had lost nearly everything except the quiet determination to remain themselves. He wondered if Ethan Cole had noticed the same thing the first time their paths crossed. According to the file, Cole supervised the agricultural detail that included Keller and 5 other prisoners. The ranch itself covered nearly 4,000 acres of dry pasture and scattered mesquite trees, land that required constant work just to remain productive. With most local men overseas in the war, ranchers across Texas had reluctantly accepted the federal labor program that brought prisoners to help maintain operations. The arrangement was practical, necessary, and carefully monitored, or at least it was supposed to be. Keene imagined the first morning those prisoners arrived at the ranch. A military truck rolling slowly down a dusty county road. Guards stepping out first, boots hitting the dirt with that unmistakable rhythm of authority. Then the women climbing down from the back of the truck, blinking against the wide Texas sky that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. For someone raised in northern Germany, the landscape alone would feel unreal. No forests, no narrow streets, just wind and horizon and the distant sound of cattle moving through tall grass. Somewhere nearby, Ethan Cole would have been waiting, hat pulled low against the sun, a man more comfortable with horses than with military paperwork. 30 years old, born on the same ranch where he now worked as foreman. A man who measured distance in miles of fence line and time in seasons of rain and drought. Keene pictured the moment their eyes might have met for the first time. Not as a dramatic scene. Not the kind of moment movies like to invent. Just a brief glance across unfamiliar ground between two people who suddenly realized the war had placed them inside the same quiet corner of the world. Neither of them could have known that somewhere months later a federal file would carry both their names. Outside the office window, the freight train horn sounded again, fading slowly into the distance as evening approached. Keene closed the folder once more and rested his hand on its cover. Somewhere out in Texas, beyond the reach of city noise and government desks, a story had unfolded quietly under the open sky. And now the government wanted to know exactly how it began. The truck arrived just after sunrise 3 days later, rolling slowly along the narrow county road that cut through miles of pale grass and scattered mesquite trees. Dust followed the tires like a thin curtain, drifting across the dry pasture where cattle grazed quietly under a sky so wide it seemed almost unreal. Ethan Cole stood beside the open gate, one boot resting against the wooden post, his hat pulled low against the morning light. He had been awake since 4:30, the way ranchmen always were, long before the sun lifted itself above the flat horizon. By the time the army transport appeared in the distance, he had already checked the windmill pumps, walked half a mile of fence line, and poured coffee into a tin mug that still warmed his hand. The truck slowed as it reached the gate, the engine rumbling softly before it stopped. 2 military guards climbed down first, their uniforms neat despite the long drive across the dusty Texas roads. One of them nodded toward Ethan in a professional way that said the routine had been repeated many times before. Then the back of the truck opened, and the women stepped down one by one into the morning air. For a moment, none of them spoke. The prairie stretched around them in every direction, a landscape of pale gold grass and slow wind that moved across the land like water. Marta Keller was the third to step down. Her boots touched the dry soil carefully, as though she were still adjusting to the weight of the world beneath her feet after months of confinement inside camp boundaries. She looked around once, quietly, taking in the unfamiliar shapes of windmills and low barns and distant cattle moving across the fields. Back in northern Germany, the land had been tighter, smaller, framed by villages and narrow roads that wound between forests. Texas felt endless. The air smelled different as well. Dry, warm, carried by a breeze that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Ethan noticed the way she stood for a moment before moving aside to let the others climb down. Not frightened, not uncertain, just attentive, as if she were measuring the place with careful patience. The guard unfolded a clipboard and began the usual instructions in English, speaking slowly so the interpreter standing near the truck could translate. The women would assist with ranch labor under supervision. 8-hour work periods with water breaks. No wandering from assigned areas. No private contact with civilian workers outside necessary tasks. Rules spoken calmly. The way rules always are when everyone already understands they exist. Marta listened without expression. She had heard similar instructions at the camp orientation months earlier. Work was work, and survival, she had learned, often depended on doing work carefully enough that people eventually trusted you. The group walked together toward the barn where the tools were kept. Gravel crunched under their boots. A hawk circled high above the pasture, riding the warm current of air that had already begun to rise from the dry ground. Ethan pushed open the barn door, and the familiar scent of hay and leather drifted out into the morning light. Inside, sunlight slipped through narrow wooden slats and stretched across the floor in long pale stripes. He handed out work gloves first, thick canvas gloves meant to protect hands from barbed wire and rough fence posts. One pair for each woman. When he reached Marta, he paused only long enough to make sure the gloves fit her hands properly. She nodded once in quiet thanks. The gesture lasted less than 2 seconds. But in that small moment, both of them noticed something simple. The other person was real. Not a symbol. Not a distant enemy described in newspaper headlines or military briefings. Just another human being standing inside the same warm Texas morning. The first task that day was fence repair along the north pasture, nearly half a mile from the barn. They walked together along a narrow path where the grass brushed against their boots and the sound of insects hummed softly in the heat that was beginning to build under the rising sun. The wire fence stretched ahead of them, leaning slightly where last winter's storms had loosened several wooden posts. Ethan demonstrated the process slowly. Pull the wire tight. Wrap the metal around the staple. Check the tension. Move to the next section. Practical work that required patience more than strength. Marta watched carefully before beginning her own section. Her movements were deliberate and steady. She had spent years assisting doctors in crowded hospital rooms, where attention to small details often mattered more than speed. Fixing a fence, she realized, required the same quiet focus. The sun climbed higher as the morning passed. By 10 o'clock the temperature had already reached 85 degrees, and the air shimmered faintly above the open pasture. One of the younger women paused to wipe sweat from her forehead. Marta noticed first. She stepped closer and spoke softly in German, suggesting a slower pace and a short break near the water container placed beneath a nearby cottonwood tree. Ethan saw the moment as well. Without making a point of it, he walked over and set down the coil of wire he had been carrying. "Break time," he said simply, gesturing toward the shade. No one argued. The women gathered beneath the tree where the breeze moved gently through the leaves, creating a soft rustling sound that blended with the distant lowing of cattle across the pasture. Marta poured water into a small tin cup and passed it carefully to the younger woman beside her. Her movements carried the quiet assurance of someone accustomed to caring for others when conditions became difficult. Ethan watched the exchange from a few yards away. The gesture reminded him of something his mother used to say during long drought summers when neighbors worked together to keep ranches alive. "People who help quietly," she used to tell him, "are the ones who hold the world together when everything else starts to come apart." Marta looked up once and noticed Ethan watching the group beneath the tree. For a moment their eyes met across the dry grass and bright sunlight. Neither of them spoke. The wind moved slowly across the pasture, carrying the smell of warm earth and distant rain that might arrive days later, or perhaps not at all. Somewhere far off a windmill creaked as it turned lazily above a water well. In that quiet moment the war felt very far away, like a storm that had passed beyond the horizon but still left its shadow across the land. Eventually the break ended and the work resumed. Wire tightened. Posts straightened. The long line of fence slowly returning to order under steady hands. By late afternoon, the repaired section stretched nearly a quarter-mile across the pasture, glinting softly in the sunlight as the wind brushed through the grass beside it. The Army truck returned just before evening to collect the workers for transport back to camp. Marta climbed into the back with the others and sat near the edge where she could watch the ranch disappear slowly behind them as the truck rolled down the dusty road. Ethan remained by the gate after they left, resting both hands on the wooden post while the engine sound faded into the distance. Above him the sky deepened into the rich gold color that Texas evenings often carried just before sunset. Work had been done. Nothing unusual had happened. Just another ordinary day during an extraordinary war. Yet as Ethan walked back toward the barn, he found himself thinking about the quiet woman who had poured water for someone else before drinking any herself. Out on the prairie, small details had a way of staying with you long after the dust settled. The next morning arrived with a pale blue sky and a wind that moved softly across the ranch like a slow breath over the open land. Ethan Cole was already outside the barn before the first light reached the eastern horizon, tightening the leather strap on a saddle while the horses shifted quietly in their stalls. The world felt larger at that hour, as if the prairie stretched farther before the sun placed edges on everything again. A thin band of orange light appeared along the horizon, spreading slowly across the grasslands that rolled for miles beyond the fence line. The army truck arrived shortly after 6 o'clock, its tires pressing shallow tracks into the dry dirt road that curved toward the ranch gate. Ethan recognized the sound of the engine before the vehicle even appeared. Ranch life had trained his ears that way. You learned to recognize distance by sound alone when land measured itself in acres instead of city blocks. The truck stopped beside the gate, and the same routine unfolded again. Guards stepped down. The back door opened. Boots touched the ground one after another. Marta Keller stepped down near the end of the line that morning, adjusting the sleeves of the cotton work shirt issued at the camp. The fabric was slightly too large for her shoulders, but she had rolled the cuffs neatly so the sleeves would not catch on wire or tools. The morning air carried a faint chill that would disappear soon once the Texas sun climbed higher. For a moment, she lifted her face toward the wind that crossed the pasture. It smelled of dust and dry grass and distant water wells. A different world from the narrow streets of Bremen, where salt air from the North Sea used to drift through the harbor. Ethan watched the group approach the barn again, the same quiet line of figures moving across the yard. Routine had a calming rhythm when repeated enough times. Work began the same way as the day before. Gloves distributed. Tools gathered. The assignment that morning involved clearing brush along a narrow irrigation ditch that ran nearly a quarter mile along the south pasture. Mesquite branches had grown thick along the bank, blocking water flow toward a small patch of sorghum planted earlier that spring. The work required steady cutting with hand tools, followed by hauling the branches into small piles where they could dry before being burned later in the season. Marta listened carefully to the instructions and nodded once before beginning her section along the ditch line. The ground there was slightly lower, where soil still held traces of moisture left by the last rainfall weeks earlier. Birds moved quietly through the brush as the workers approached, lifting into the air in small bursts of wings before settling again farther down the bank. The sun climbed steadily higher through the morning, spreading warmth across the prairie until the air shimmered faintly above the ground. By 9:30 the temperature had already reached 80 degrees, and the dry wind had begun to move more steadily from the west. Ethan worked several yards away, using a long-handled cutter to remove thicker branches from the ditch edge. Every few minutes he glanced down the line to make sure everyone was working safely. The guards remained near the truck parked beneath a cottonwood tree, their silhouettes small against the wide landscape. Marta worked slowly but efficiently. Her movements followed a steady rhythm. Cut the branch. Pull it aside. Clear the path along the water channel. Her hospital training had taught her that careful repetition often solved problems more effectively than speed. At one point, she paused to examine a small cut that had appeared along the hand of another worker who had brushed against a sharp thorn. The injury was minor, but Marta instinctively reached into the pocket of her work shirtwear. She carried a small piece of clean cloth. She wrapped the cloth around the hand gently, tying a knot tight enough to keep the dust away from the skin. The entire exchange lasted less than a minute. Ethan noticed it anyway, not the wound itself, just the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years responding to small problems before they became larger ones. Later that morning the wind shifted slightly, bringing a thin layer of dust across the pasture from a distant cattle trail. Ethan walked over to where the workers had placed their water container beneath a patch of shade along the ditch bank. He filled a tin cup and set it down on a flat stone nearby, so the group could reach it easily during breaks. When Marta approached a few minutes later, she noticed the cup already waiting there. She looked up briefly in Ethan's direction and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. No words passed between them, but the gesture remained. The work continued through the late morning hours as the sun climbed toward its highest point above the open prairie. Around 11:30 the air had grown warm enough that the guards called for a short rest period beneath the cottonwood tree near the truck. The group walked slowly toward the shade, boots pressing into the dry soil that cracked faintly under each step. Marta sat on the ground near the trunk where the shade was deepest, resting her hands loosely on her knees while the breeze moved through the leaves overhead. Ethan leaned against the truck tire a few yards away, pouring water from a metal jug into several cups. For a moment the entire scene felt strangely peaceful. Wind in the leaves, distant cattle shifting across the pasture, the quiet murmur of voices speaking German among the workers. Then something unexpected happened. Marta noticed it first. A faint sound drifting across the open land beyond the pasture fence. It was music, very soft at first, just the distant echo of a radio playing somewhere far down the road where another ranch house sat nearly half a mile away. The signal carried across the prairie because nothing stood in the way of sound out there. The melody floated through the warm air in broken pieces as the wind shifted. Ethan recognized it after a moment. A popular American swing tune that had been played frequently on the radio that year. Marta tilted her head slightly as she listened. The rhythm felt unfamiliar but strangely comforting at the same time. For a few seconds, she closed her eyes, letting the distant music drift through the quiet shade beneath the tree. When she opened them again, Ethan was looking in the same direction, listening to the same faint melody crossing the prairie between two very different worlds. Neither of them spoke, but in that moment something subtle changed. The distance between prisoner and ranch worker felt slightly smaller than it had the day before. The wind carried the music away again as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only the sound of rustling leaves and the slow breathing of cattle across the field. The break ended soon after, and everyone returned to work along the irrigation ditch. Yet as the afternoon moved forward beneath the bright Texas sky, Ethan found himself thinking about the quiet way Marta had listened to the music drifting across the prairie, as though it had reminded her of something from another life that existed long before the war had carried her thousands of miles from home. The following morning arrived wrapped in a quiet gray sky that stretched low over the Texas plains, the kind of sky that promised heat later but offered a brief moment of cool air before the sun claimed the day. Ethan Cole stood beside the windmill well behind the barn, listening to the slow-turning creak of the metal blades as they pulled water from the deep ground beneath the ranch. The sound had been part of his life since childhood, a steady rhythm that marked the passing of mornings the same way church bells mark time in towns farther east. The cattle had already begun moving across the pasture, dark shapes drifting through pale grass, while the breeze brushed softly across the land. The army truck arrived a little later than usual that day, rolling down the dirt road with a longer trail of dust behind it. Ethan noticed immediately that the wind had shifted overnight, pushing dry air from the south instead of the west. On the prairie, those small changes mattered. Weather shaped everything: work, water, and sometimes the mood of people themselves. The truck stopped at the gate, and the guards climbed down with their usual quiet efficiency. The back door opened, and the women stepped out one by one, their boots touching the ground with the familiar crunch of dry soil beneath leather soles. Marta Keller stepped down near the center of the group that morning. She had tied her hair back more tightly than the day before, a practical habit learned from years working in hospital corridors where loose strands could interfere with delicate tasks. Her eyes moved briefly across the ranch yard as though she were noting details the same way she had studied the irrigation ditch the previous day. The barn, the fence line, the windmill turning slowly against the gray sky. Nothing dramatic, just observation. Ethan opened the barn door and handed out gloves again while explaining the day's assignment. A section of pasture nearly half a mile east of the main house needed attention. A storm earlier in the spring had knocked several fence posts loose, and the cattle had begun wandering too close to the county road. The repair would require digging new post holes nearly 3 feet into the ground and resetting the wire line across the pasture ridge. It was steady work, not difficult, but demanding patience and careful effort. The group walked together across the open field where the grass brushed their boots and small insects lifted from the ground in quiet bursts of motion. The sky above remained pale and overcast, but the air already carried warmth that hinted at the sun waiting behind the clouds. Marta walked near the middle of the line, her eyes occasionally lifting toward the horizon where the land rolled gently into the distance. There was something about the vastness of Texas that still surprised her even after weeks working outside the camp. In Germany, distance had always been measured by towns, by church towers rising above rooftops. Here distance was measured by the horizon itself. The work began once they reached the damaged section of fence. Ethan demonstrated the placement of the new posts, measuring the spacing by steps the way ranchers often did after years of working the same land. 10 feet between posts. Dig straight down until the soil became firm enough to hold weight. Pack the dirt tightly around the base so the wind would not loosen the line again. Marta took one of the post hole diggers and began working the ground beside another worker. The soil there was dry, but not hard, a mixture of sandy earth and pale clay that loosened slowly with each push of the metal blades. The rhythm of digging settled into the morning. Push down, lift, turn the soil aside, repeat. The sound of metal striking earth blended with the steady whisper of wind moving through the grass. By mid-morning, the clouds began to thin and the sunlight filtered through in wide pale beams that stretched across the pasture. Ethan moved along the fence line, checking each post as it was placed. When he reached Marta's section, he noticed the hole she had dug was slightly deeper than the others, nearly 3.5 feet into the ground. He paused for a moment before speaking. That one will hold through any storm this land can offer. His voice carried the calm tone of someone stating a practical fact rather than offering praise. Marta looked up briefly, brushing a small streak of soil from her sleeve before answering in careful English. In my country, storms often come from the sea. The wind can be very strong. It is better to prepare before it arrives. Ethan nodded once, understanding the logic even though the oceans of Europe were thousands of miles away from the Texas plains. They placed the wooden post into the hole together, packing the earth tightly around its base until it stood firm against the wind. A small moment of shared work that passed quickly, unnoticed by the others who continued digging farther down the line. Near noon, the guards called for a short break beside a cluster of mesquite trees that offered a narrow strip of shade across the ridge. The group gathered there with their water cups while the breeze moved softly across the open land. Marta sat on a fallen branch, her hands resting quietly in her lap while she drank from the tin cup Ethan had filled earlier from the well barrel. The water tasted slightly metallic from the pump, but cool enough to ease the heat that had begun building under the strengthening sun. Ethan stood nearby, leaning against a fence post that had not yet been secured. For a while neither of them spoke. The prairie stretched around them in every direction, the silence broken only by wind and the distant lowing of cattle grazing along the far pasture. Then Marta spoke again, her voice quiet, but steady. The land here feels very large. Larger than any place I have known before. Ethan glanced across the horizon before answering. When you grow up on land like this, you forget how wide it looks to someone seeing it for the first time. He paused before adding a thought that surprised even himself. Sometimes the land makes people quieter. Marta considered that sentence for a moment before nodding slowly. In Germany, the cities are crowded. There is always noise. Here the wind speaks louder than people. The remark carried no complaint, only observation. Ethan found himself smiling slightly at the way she described the prairie as if it were something alive. A few minutes later the break ended and the work resumed along the fence line. The sun had fully broken through the clouds by then, spreading bright light across the ridge and casting long shadows beneath the posts that now stood upright in the ground. As the afternoon moved forward, the repaired section of fence stretched steadily across the pasture like a line drawn carefully across the landscape. By the time the army truck returned near sunset, the work was nearly complete. Marta climbed into the back of the truck with the others, her hands dusty from the soil, but her posture still calm as she settled onto the wooden bench along the side panel. Ethan remained by the fence for a moment after the truck pulled away, watching the dust drift slowly across the road as evening settled over the ranch. The windmill turned quietly behind him, and the long new fence posts stood firm against the breeze, their shadows stretching across the grass as the sun slipped toward the western horizon. The following week unfolded slowly beneath a sky that seemed to grow wider with every passing day. Summer had settled fully over the Texas plains, and the air now carried the steady warmth of late June from sunrise until the last light slipped behind the distant ridges. Ethan Cole woke each morning before the first pale ribbon of sunlight appeared along the eastern horizon. The ranch had always demanded that rhythm. Horses needed water. Gates needed checking. Windmills needed listening. A man who lived on open land learned quickly that quiet details kept everything running. The army truck continued arriving just after 6 o'clock, its familiar engine echoing across the dirt road before. The vehicle even reached the ranch gate. By now the routine felt almost ordinary. The guard stepped down, exchanged a brief greeting with Ethan, and opened the rear door. The women climbed down one by one, their boots meeting the earth with the same steady sound of leather against dry soil. Marta Keller always paused for the smallest moment after stepping down. Not long enough for anyone to call it hesitation. Just long enough to look across the ranch yard as though confirming the place was exactly as she remembered it from the day before. The windmill, the barn, the long fence stretching toward the horizon. Routine had begun shaping the days into something familiar. Work changed depending on what the land required. Some mornings they repaired fence lines where cattle had pressed too hard against aging posts. Other days they cleared irrigation channels where dust and grass threatened the slow movement of water across the fields. Once they spent nearly an entire day stacking cut hay inside the barn loft where the air smelled thick with dried grass and warm sunlight. Marta approached each task with the same quiet focus she had shown during the first week. She asked few questions, but she listened carefully when instructions were given. Her English remained careful and measured, each word spoken with the patience of someone building a bridge between languages one sentence at a time. Ethan noticed the pattern without trying to. Small details repeated themselves when people worked together long enough. Marta always checked the water container before beginning her task, making sure the others could reach it easily when the heat climbed higher. When tools were returned at the end of the day, she placed them carefully along the barn wall rather than leaving them scattered across the floor. The habits reminded Ethan of the way his mother used to keep the ranch house kitchen in perfect order even during the hardest drought seasons. Quiet discipline that asked for no praise. One afternoon near the end of that week, the work assignment brought them to the far pasture beyond a shallow creek bed that crossed the property nearly a mile from the main barn. The creek rarely carried water during summer months, but the banks still needed clearing so autumn rains would not flood the nearby grazing land. The walk there took nearly 20 minutes across open grass that shimmered under the bright afternoon sun. The temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees, and the air carried the faint smell of dust rising from cattle trails that wound across the pasture. Marta walked beside one of the younger women from the camp, her steps steady despite the heat. Ethan followed several yards behind with a coil of wire over one shoulder and a shovel resting against his other arm. When they reached the creek bank, the group spread out along the shallow channel where clusters of dry brush had begun blocking the path where water would eventually flow. The work required patience. Cutting branches, pulling roots, clearing stones from the narrow bed where rainwater might pass later in the year. The sun moved slowly across the sky, while the wind carried small clouds of dust through the tall grass nearby. By midday the heat had grown heavy enough that the guards called for a longer rest period beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree standing near the edge of the creek. Its branches stretched wide above the dry bank, offering the only patch of deep shade for several hundred yards. The workers gathered there quietly, lowering themselves onto the cool ground while the breeze moved gently through the leaves overhead. Marta sat with her back against the tree trunk, her eyes closed for a moment while she let the wind cool the heat that had settled across her face. Ethan poured water into the tin cups again, passing them carefully along the small circle of workers beneath the tree. When he reached Marta, she opened her eyes and accepted the cup with a quiet thank you spoken in soft English. They sat in silence for several minutes while the prairie breathed slowly around them. Somewhere far away, a pickup truck moved along the county road, its distant engine sound rising and fading across the open land. Marta looked toward the horizon for a moment before speaking again. In my country, there are rivers everywhere. Even small towns have water running through them. She paused as though measuring the thought carefully before continuing. Here the land waits a long time for rain. Ethan rested his arms across his knees while considering her words. That is true, he said quietly. Sometimes the land waits months. But when the rain finally comes, everything grows quickly. Marta looked down at the dry creek bed stretching past the tree roots and nodded slowly. Where I grew up, my father used to say that land and people are not so different. Both need patience when seasons become difficult. The remark carried no sadness, only memory. Ethan felt the truth of it settle somewhere deep inside the quiet afternoon air. The wind moved across the prairie again, stirring the tall grass into slow waves that rolled toward the horizon like water itself. After the break ended, they returned to the work along the creek bank, clearing the last sections of brush before the sun began its slow descent toward evening. By the time the army truck returned, the shadows had already begun stretching across the pasture, long dark shapes reaching from the cottonwood tree toward the dusty road. Marta climbed into the truck with the others and settled along the wooden bench as the engine started again. Ethan remained near the creek bank for a moment after the vehicle disappeared beyond the hill. The wind carried the smell of dry grass and distant rain clouds forming somewhere far beyond the horizon. And for reasons he could not easily explain, Ethan found himself thinking about Marta Keller's quiet remark beneath the cottonwood tree, the simple idea that land and people both needed patience when seasons became difficult. The next few days moved across the Texas plains with the slow rhythm that only wide land can create. Mornings beginning in pale blue light, and evenings ending beneath skies so large that the last glow of sunset lingered long after the work was finished. Ethan Cole had always believed that people revealed themselves most clearly in quiet routines, not in dramatic moments. On a ranch, there was little space for performance. A person either worked steadily or they did not. They either paid attention to the small details that kept land alive, or they ignored them until something broke. By the second week of Marta Keller working beyond the camp fences, Ethan had begun noticing something else about her that did not belong in any official report. She watched the land the way ranchers watched it, not as scenery, as something living. One morning, just after sunrise, the wind carried a faint smell that most people would have missed completely. A distant trace of moisture drifting across the pasture from somewhere beyond the western ridges. Ethan paused near the windmill and lifted his head slightly, testing the air the way he had learned as a boy. Rain. Not today. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe 2 days from now if the clouds move the right direction. The army truck arrived minutes later, rolling toward the gate with its familiar engine hum. The guard stepped down and opened the back door while dust swirled slowly across the road behind them. Marta stepped onto the ground and adjusted the collar of her work shirt as she always did, her eyes lifting briefly toward the sky before joining the others near the barn. Ethan handed out gloves and tools while explaining the task for the morning. A water trough in the north pasture needed cleaning before the cattle were moved to a new grazing section. The trough collected sediment during dry weeks, and if it was not cleared regularly, the pump line would clog when the windmill began drawing water again. The walk to the trough took nearly 15 minutes across open grass that glowed pale gold under the early sunlight. The sky above was clear except for a long, thin line of clouds far to the west that drifted slowly across the horizon. Marta noticed them immediately. Her eyes followed the movement while she walked, studying the distant shapes with quiet attention. When they reached the trough, Ethan knelt beside the pump handle and tested the mechanism. The metal creaked softly but still held steady under pressure. The group began clearing the basin with shovels and buckets, removing the fine layer of dust and dry leaves that had gathered along the bottom. It was slow work under the growing warmth of the morning sun. The smell of dry soil mixed with the faint metallic scent of the pump, while the wind moved gently across the pasture. Marta worked steadily beside another woman from the camp, her movements careful as she lifted the sediment from the basin. After several minutes, she paused and glanced again toward the western sky. The thin line of clouds had grown slightly thicker. Not much, just enough to notice if someone was watching carefully. She spoke quietly to Ethan when he stepped beside the trough to check their progress. Those clouds were not there yesterday morning. Ethan followed her gaze toward the horizon. He studied the distant sky for a moment before nodding once. You are right. They are. Building higher than yesterday. Marta returned to her work, but added a quiet thought as she lifted another bucket of sediment. Where I grew up, the fishermen used to watch clouds the same way. The sea could change quickly if you ignored them. Ethan smiled faintly at the comparison. The prairie and the sea did not look alike, but in some ways they behaved the same. Wide places demanded attention. By late morning the trough had been cleared and the pump line tested. Ethan worked the handle again, and this time a thin stream of cool water flowed into the basin, spreading slowly across the clean metal bottom. The cattle grazing nearby lifted their heads briefly before returning to the grass. The guards allowed a short rest period beneath a small cluster of cedar trees that stood along the edge of the pasture. The shade there was narrow but enough to break the heat that had begun building across the open land. Marta sat with her back against the trunk of one of the trees, her hands folded loosely in her lap, while she watched the wind ripple through the tall grass beyond the trough. Ethan poured water into the tin cups again and handed one to her before sitting a few feet away on a fallen branch. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The quiet felt natural beneath the moving clouds and the distant sound of cattle shifting across the field. Then Marta lifted her eyes toward the sky again. In Germany, storms often arrive in the afternoon after clouds gather like that. Ethan studied the horizon once more. The cloud line had grown darker now, spreading slowly upward into shapes that suggested rising moisture somewhere beyond the hills. He nodded thoughtfully. If the wind keeps moving this direction, we might see rain tonight. Marta looked down at the water trough where the first thin pool of water had begun reflecting the pale sky above. She spoke softly, almost to herself. Rain changes everything very quickly. The remark stayed with Ethan as the group returned to work and finished securing the pump line for the cattle. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had grown noticeably thicker across the western sky, their shadows stretching faintly across the grass as the sunlight softened. The army truck arrived later that day than usual because another work crew had been delayed near the camp gate. Marta climbed into the back with the others while the guards closed the door and signaled the driver to move. Ethan remained near the trough watching the dust rise behind the departing truck until it disappeared beyond the pasture ridge. The wind had strengthened slightly now, carrying a cooler breath across the land. When he looked again toward the horizon, the clouds were darker still, building slowly across the wide Texas sky exactly the way Marta Keller had predicted hours earlier. And for the first time since the war had begun shaping lives far beyond this quiet ranch, Ethan found himself wondering how many other things the quiet German woman might see before anyone else noticed them. That night the rain finally arrived exactly the way Marta Keller had predicted, beginning as a distant whisper against the far pastures before moving slowly across the land like a curtain drawn over the sky. Ethan Cole heard the first drops just after midnight when the windmill changed its rhythm outside the ranch house window. Rain sounded different on the plains than it did in towns. There were no rooftops or streets to catch the first impact. The sound came from the grass itself, thousands of small taps spreading across miles of open ground. By morning the storm had already passed, leaving behind a cool gray sky and the deep earthy smell that only fresh rain could bring to dry land. Ethan stepped outside just after sunrise and paused near the porch railing while he looked across the pasture. The grass had darkened overnight, bending slightly under the weight of the moisture that clung to every blade. Small puddles reflected the pale sky near the cattle trail where the ground dipped low. The air felt cooler than it had in weeks. The windmill turned more slowly now, the breeze carrying a steady dampness that softened the harsh edges of summer heat. When the army truck arrived that morning, its tires moved more carefully along the dirt road, leaving shallow tracks in the damp soil behind it. The guards climbed down as usual, but even their boots sounded different against the ground, pressing softly into the wet earth instead of kicking up dust. Marta Keller stepped down from the truck and lifted her face slightly toward the air. The smell of rain lingered everywhere. She closed her eyes for a brief moment as the breeze moved across the pasture. The scent reminded her of something distant. Not Texas, not the camp, something older. The quiet harbor mornings of Bremen where rain used to drift across the docks before the fishing boats returned to shore. Ethan noticed the small pause, but said nothing. He simply opened the barn door and handed out the tools for the morning. The storm had left work to be done. Sections of pasture fence, sometimes loosened after rain, softened the soil, and the drainage ditch near the eastern grazing area needed checking to be certain water had not pooled in the wrong places overnight. The group walked across the ranch together, their boots sinking slightly into the softened ground as the early sun began pushing through the gray clouds above. The land looked different after rain. Colors deepened. The The pale grass now carried a richer shade of green. Even the distant hills appeared sharper beneath the clearer air. Marta noticed every detail. She walked more slowly than usual for a few moments, studying the way the storm had changed the ground beneath her feet. When they reached the eastern ditch, Ethan crouched beside the narrow channel and tested the soil along the edge with the blade of his shovel. The ground held firm enough. No flooding. The water had passed through cleanly during the night and continued down toward the lower fields beyond the ranch boundary. Good drainage, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Marta knelt beside the ditch and touched the damp soil between her fingers. In my country, the farmers always worry when rain falls too fast. She brushed the soil from her hand and looked along the shallow channel. But this land seems to drink it slowly. Ethan nodded once. Out here the ground learns patience. If it rushes the water away too quickly, the grass dies. The remark hung quietly between them while the others began clearing small branches that the storm had carried into the ditch overnight. Work moved steadily that morning beneath a sky that gradually brightened as the clouds thinned. By mid-morning the sun had returned, though the air remained cool enough that the breeze felt refreshing instead of harsh. The guards allowed a short break beneath the cottonwood tree near the edge of the pasture. Marta sat on the grass again, stretching her legs slightly while she accepted the tin cup of water Ethan offered her. The ground beneath the tree still held moisture from the storm, and the scent of wet leaves mixed with the earthy smell rising from the soil. Ethan leaned against the trunk of the tree while he watched the clouds drift slowly apart above them. Marta looked toward the horizon where sunlight had begun touching the distant hills again. Rain like that would help the grass grow quickly. Ethan followed her gaze across the pasture. It will. Give it a few days, and you will see the difference. Marta smiled faintly at the thought. In Germany, people sometimes say that rain is the quiet friend of farmers. Ethan considered the phrase for a moment before replying. My father used to say something similar. He always believed storms were not enemies. They were reminders that the land was still alive. The wind moved softly through the leaves above them, sending small drops of leftover rainwater falling gently onto the ground. Marta watched the droplets for a moment before speaking again. It is strange how land can make people feel connected even when they come from very different places. Ethan did not answer immediately. He understood what she meant, even though neither of them had spoken directly about the war that had placed them here on opposite sides of a line drawn by governments and armies. Out on the ranch, that line felt less visible with each passing day. The break ended soon after, and the group returned to work along the ditch and fence line where the storm had loosened several posts. Marta worked steadily beside Ethan that afternoon, packing damp soil tightly around the base of the wooden posts while the sun dried the grass around them. The air remained cool, and the breeze carried the scent of rain long after the clouds had disappeared. By late afternoon the repairs were finished, and the pasture looked almost untouched by the storm that had crossed the land only hours earlier. When the army truck returned, Marta climbed inside with the others and took her usual seat near the rear panel where she could watch the ranch disappear slowly behind them as the vehicle moved down the dirt road. Ethan remained by the fence again as the truck drove away, his eyes following the fading trail of damp dust until it disappeared beyond the low hill. The sky above the ranch had turned clear and bright now, washed clean by the storm. And somewhere deep in the quiet of that wide Texas afternoon, Ethan realized that the land had begun changing more than just the grass beneath their feet. The morning after the storm carried a kind of stillness that only appeared on the plains when the land had finally taken its share of rain. The sky stretched wide and pale above the ranch, washed clean during the night, so that even the farthest hills seemed sharper against the horizon. Ethan Cole stepped out of the barn shortly before sunrise and paused beside the windmill well, listening to the slow turning of the blades as they pulled cool water up from the ground. The grass beneath his boots still held traces of moisture, dark and heavy compared to the pale dust of the previous weeks. Somewhere beyond the pasture a meadowlark called once, its voice rising into the quiet morning air before fading again. When the army truck arrived that day, the sunlight had only just begun touching the tops of the cottonwood trees along the creek bed. The vehicle rolled through the ranch gate more slowly than usual, its tires still careful on the damp earth left by the storm. The guards climbed down and opened the back door while the engine idled quietly beside the barn. Marta Keller stepped down near the end of the line, her boots touching the ground with the soft sound of wet soil pressing under leather. For a moment, she simply stood there and breathed in the cool air. The rain had changed the scent of the entire valley. The dry dust that had filled the wind for weeks was gone. In its place came the deeper smell of grass and damp earth rising slowly into the morning light. Ethan noticed the way she looked across the pasture again, studying the land as though it were something new. The ranch often looked different after rain. Small details appeared that dry weather usually hid. Tiny green shoots pushing through the soil. Patches of darker grass where moisture collected in shallow dips. Even the distant cattle seemed more alert, moving slowly through the pasture as though they understood the land had shifted back toward life again. Ethan opened the barn door and gathered the tools for the morning while explaining the work that needed attention. The storm had filled a shallow reservoir near the western boundary of the ranch, and the narrow trench that carried water from that basin to the lower grazing field had become partially blocked during the night. If the trench remained closed, the water would spread across the wrong section of land and turn the grass there into mud within days. The walk toward the reservoir took nearly half an hour that morning because the ground remained soft beneath their boots. Marta moved carefully along the narrow cattle trail that curved through the pasture, her eyes following the small channels of rainwater that still wound through the grass. The sky above had cleared completely now, and sunlight spread slowly across the plains as the day began warming again. When they reached the reservoir, Ethan stopped near the bank and looked down at the water level. The basin had filled higher than usual during the storm. The surface reflected the pale sky like a mirror broken only by the gentle movement of wind across the water. Marta stepped closer and studied the edge of the basin where the trench opened toward the lower field. Mud and broken grass had collapsed into the narrow channel, forming a barrier that slowed the outflow. Ethan handed her one of the shovels and pointed toward the trench line. "We need to clear that opening so the water can move again. If it stays blocked, the field below will flood by tomorrow." Marta nodded once and stepped carefully into the shallow mud along the bank. The ground felt cool and soft beneath her boots, the kind of earth that clung to metal tools and required patience to move. She began lifting the wet soil from the trench while the others worked along the edges, clearing away the tangled grass left by the storm. The work was slower than usual because each shovel of mud carried extra weight from the rainwater trapped inside it. But the rhythm remained steady. Lift, turn, clear the path. The wind moved across the reservoir in slow ripples that caught the sunlight and scattered it across the water like small fragments of glass. By mid-morning, the trench had opened enough for a thin stream to begin moving toward the lower pasture. Marta leaned on the handle of the shovel for a moment and watched the water flow through the channel they had cleared. The sound was soft but steady. Ethan stepped beside her and followed her gaze along the moving stream. "That will keep the field dry below," he said quietly. Marta nodded and wiped a small line of mud from her sleeve. "Water always finds a path if you give it enough space." Ethan looked at the channel again before answering. "The land works the same way. If you understand how it moves, you can help it instead of fighting it." The guards called for a short rest beneath a group of cedar trees near the edge of the basin. Marta sat on a smooth stone while Ethan poured water into the tin cups again. The breeze carried the smell of wet grass across the open field, and the quiet surface of the reservoir reflected the clear sky above them. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The moment felt calm in a way that few places had been since the war began shaping lives across continents. Then Marta spoke softly while watching the water continue down the narrow trench. "In Germany, my father used to repair the small canals near our town every spring. He believed that if you cared for the water, the land would care for you in return." Ethan considered the thought while the wind moved gently through the cedar branches overhead. "My father believed something similar about fences. He used to say that if you kept the land in order, the land would keep you in order as well." Marta smiled slightly at the comparison before lowering her eyes toward the ground again. "It seems fathers in many countries say similar things." The remark lingered quietly in the air between them while the breeze moved across the water. By early afternoon, the trench had been fully cleared, and the reservoir water flowed freely into the lower field where the grass would soon grow thicker because of the storm. When the army truck arrived, Marta climbed into the back with the others and took her usual place along the bench where she could watch the ranch fade slowly into the distance. Ethan remained beside the reservoir bank for several minutes after the truck disappeared along the road. The sunlight had grown warmer again, and the stream of water continued moving quietly through the trench Marta had cleared. For the first time since the war had carried strangers across oceans and borders, the ranch felt less like a place divided by uniforms and more like land quietly shared by people who understood the same simple truths about water, soil, and patience. The following week unfolded beneath a sky that seemed almost endlessly clear, the kind of wide Texas sky that made the horizon feel farther away every morning. The storm that had passed days earlier had left its quiet mark across the ranch. Grass that had been pale and brittle during the dry weeks now carried a deeper shade of green, and the cattle moved through the pasture with a slower, steadier rhythm as fresh shoots pushed through the soil. Ethan Cole noticed the change every morning before the army truck arrived. A rancher learned to read the land the same way sailors read the sea. Small differences told the whole story. The windmill turned with a steadier sound now, because the breeze had softened after the storm. The reservoir held a thin silver sheet of water instead of the cracked mud it had shown only a week earlier. Even the birds seemed to move differently, circling lower above the grass as if they too understood the land had shifted into a gentler season. When the truck arrived that morning, the sunlight had already warmed the pasture enough that a faint mist rose from the damp ground near the reservoir basin. The guards climbed down and opened the rear door while the engine idled quietly beside the barn. Marta Keller stepped onto the ground and paused briefly again, her eyes moving across the ranch yard the way they had every day since her first arrival. But something about her posture had changed slightly during the past week. The careful tension that had once held her shoulders straight had softened. The land had a way of doing that to people. Wide places allowed breath where crowded places did not. Ethan handed out gloves and tools while explaining the task for the day. A stretch of fence along the northern grazing boundary needed tightening after the storm had loosened several wire sections. It was routine work, but necessary if the cattle were to be moved toward the fresh grass growing near the creek bed. The walk north took longer than usual because the cattle trail curved around several shallow dips where rainwater still collected in narrow pools. Marta walked beside the others, her boots stepping carefully through the damp grass while the wind moved softly across the open land. She noticed the small birds rising from the pasture ahead of them, and the way the sunlight caught the thin threads of spider webs stretched between the fence posts. Details like that had always drawn her attention even before the war changed the course of her life. When they reached the fence line, Ethan set down the coil of wire and began demonstrating how to pull tension across the older sections that had begun to sag. The metal creaked softly as it tightened against the posts. Marta took a pair of pliers and moved several yards down the fence to begin securing one of the loose sections. The work required patience more than strength. Pull the wire. Twist the strand. Anchor the tension against the staple hammered into the post. The breeze carried the smell of grass and damp earth while the sound of tools tapping lightly against metal echoed across the pasture. Ethan worked nearby, occasionally glancing along the fence line to be certain the repairs remained even. At one point, Marta paused and ran her fingers lightly along the wire after tightening the strand. It felt solid again, the tension restored the way it should have been before the storm. Ethan noticed the small gesture and walked over to check her work. He gave the wire a firm pull and nodded once. That section will hold. Marta lowered the pliers and brushed a thin streak of dust from her sleeve. Storms test many things, she said quietly. Fences, soil, people. Ethan looked along the repaired line stretching across the pasture before answering. The land always tells you where the weak places are. Marta smiled slightly at the remark and returned to her task along the next post. The morning moved steadily beneath the warm sunlight, while the repairs continued down the long stretch of fence. By late morning, the guards called for a short rest period beneath a group of mesquite trees growing along the edge of the grazing field. The shade there was thin but enough to soften the heat that had begun building under the open sky. Marta sat on the grass and accepted the tin cup of water Ethan offered her. The breeze moved through the mesquite branches above them, scattering small patches of sunlight across the ground. For several minutes the group remained quiet, each person resting in the calm that followed steady work. Marta watched the cattle grazing across the far side of the pasture, their slow movement creating a quiet rhythm against the wide horizon. After a moment she spoke again, her voice soft but thoughtful. When I first arrived here, I believed this land would feel completely foreign to me. Ethan looked across the pasture before answering. And now? Marta considered the question carefully. Now it feels different. Not familiar exactly, but understandable. The grass grows the same way everywhere if rain and sunlight arrive together. Ethan nodded slowly. The land does not care where someone was born. It only cares how people treat it. Marta lowered her eyes toward the grass for a moment, as though considering that thought deeply. Then she spoke again with quiet honesty. Sometimes I think the land teaches people patience when the rest of the world forgets it. Ethan did not answer immediately. The wind moved softly across the field while the cattle continued grazing beyond the fence they had just repaired. Finally, he spoke in the same calm tone he used when discussing ranch work. Maybe that is why people who live close to the land tend to speak less. They spend more time listening. Marta smiled faintly at the remark and finished the last sip of water from her cup. The break ended soon after, and the work resumed along the fence line. By early afternoon, the repaired wire stretched tight across the pasture again, glinting softly beneath the bright Texas sun. When the army truck returned, Marta climbed into the back with the others and took her usual seat along the wooden bench. As the truck moved slowly down the dirt road, she looked once more across the ranch where the windmill turned steadily and the long fence line now stood firm against the breeze. Ethan remained near the final post they had secured that day, watching the dust trail fade behind the departing truck. The pasture felt quiet again beneath the open sky. Yet somewhere within that quiet he sensed a change that had nothing to do with fences or storms or even the growing grass across the land. Something deeper had begun shifting during those long mornings of shared work beneath the Texas sun, something neither of them had spoken aloud, but both had quietly begun to understand. By the time the following week began, the rhythm of work on the ranch had settled into something that felt almost predictable. The summer sun rose earlier each morning, spreading pale gold light across the wide Texas plains long before the army truck appeared at the ranch gate. Ethan Cole had already finished his first round of chores by the time the eastern horizon turned bright. He checked the windmill pump, walked the fence line near the southern pasture, and filled the water trough beside the barn, while the air still carried the cool softness of early morning. Out on the plains, the first hour after sunrise always felt different from the rest of the day. The wind moved more gently then, and even the cattle grazed in quieter patterns before the heat began to rise. When the truck finally appeared on the road that morning, its engine sound traveled clearly across the open land. Dust lifted lightly behind its tires, though not as heavily as it had before the rain softened the soil earlier in the week. The guards stepped down from the cab with their usual calm routine, exchanging brief nods with Ethan before opening the back door. Marta Keller climbed down with the others, her boots touching the ground with a steady rhythm that had become familiar during the past weeks. She paused for that same brief moment again, letting her eyes move across the ranch yard as though confirming that everything remained exactly where it should be. The barn door stood open. The windmill turned slowly against the pale sky. The long pasture fence stretched toward the distant hills where the morning sunlight now touched the grass. Ethan gathered the tools for the day and explained the work that needed attention. A section of grazing land along the western ridge required preparation before the cattle could be moved there. The storm earlier in the week had encouraged fresh grass growth, but the old gate posts along the ridge had begun leaning slightly after years of weather and wind. They would need to dig new holes, reset the posts, and rebuild the narrow gate that controlled movement between the pastures. The walk toward the ridge took longer than usual because the grass along that section of land had grown thicker since the rain. Marta walked quietly with the others along the cattle trail that curved across the slope. As they climbed higher, the view across the ranch widened behind them. The reservoir shimmered in the distance like a thin piece of glass, and the windmill blades turned slowly above the barn roof far below. When they reached the ridge, Ethan set down the shovel and measured the placement of the new posts by pacing the distance between the old ones. Marta watched the process carefully before beginning to dig beside him. The soil there was firmer than the lower pasture because wind had dried the surface more quickly along the higher ground. Each push of the shovel sent small clumps of earth rolling down the slope toward the grass below. The rhythm of digging soon settled across the ridge, metal blades striking soil, the quiet scrape of dirt against wood, the breeze moving steadily along the hilltop. Marta worked steadily beside Ethan, occasionally brushing loose strands of soil from the edge of the hole she was shaping. After several minutes, she paused and glanced toward the wide view stretching across the plains. The ranch looked smaller from that height, almost like a map drawn across the land below. Ethan noticed her looking out over the valley and followed her gaze. "It feels different up here," she said quietly. "The land looks peaceful when you see it from above." Ethan leaned on the handle of his shovel for a moment while studying the distant pastures. "It usually is peaceful," he answered calmly. "Most days the land does exactly what it is supposed to do." Marta nodded slightly before returning to her work. Sometimes the world far away forgets that places like this still exist. Ethan understood what she meant without asking for more explanation. The war had turned many places into noise and uncertainty, but the ranch continued its slow, steady cycle of work and weather the same way it had for decades. By late morning, the first new gate post stood firmly in the ground, its base packed tightly with soil to hold it steady against wind and cattle pressure. Marta stepped back and tested the stability by pushing gently against the wood. It did not move. Ethan gave a small approving nod before beginning the next hole a few feet away. The guards eventually called for a rest period beneath a cluster of low cedar trees that offered a narrow patch of shade along the ridge. Marta sat on the grass and accepted the tin cup of water Ethan offered her while the breeze cooled the heat that had begun building under the rising sun. The view from the ridge remained wide and quiet. Cattle moved slowly across the lower pasture, their shapes small against the open land. Marta looked across the valley again before speaking softly. "When I was a child, my father once took me to a hill outside our town. From the top, we could see the river and the houses all together. He told me that when you look from high places you understand how small people really are compared to the land." Ethan considered that thought for a moment while the wind moved through the cedar branches above them. "My father used to say something similar about storms," he replied. "He believed that when you watched lightning from far away you understood that the land had always been stronger than the things people built on it." Marta smiled faintly at the comparison before finishing the last sip of water in her cup. The break ended soon after, and they returned to work along the ridge. By early afternoon, the new gate posts stood upright and secure, their fresh wood bright against the darker grass surrounding them. Ethan attached the iron hinges while Marta helped hold the gate frame steady until the bolts were tightened into place. When the work was finished, the gate swung open smoothly toward the new pasture waiting beyond the ridge. Marta stepped back and watched the movement of the wood for a moment before speaking quietly. "That gate will guide the cattle in the right direction." Ethan nodded. "The land gives people many paths," he said. "A good gate simply helps choose the right one." When the army truck returned later that afternoon, Marta climbed inside with the others and looked once more across the ridge before the vehicle turned down the road toward the camp. Ethan remained near the gate after the truck disappeared, resting his hand against the new wooden post while the wind moved steadily across the hilltop. The land stretched quietly in every direction beneath the warm Texas sun, and somewhere within that quiet he sensed that the path their lives had begun walking together was slowly opening, just like the new gate standing on the ridge. The days following the work on the ridge moved forward with the quiet steadiness that defined late summer on the Texas plains. Morning sunlight arrived earlier now, spreading long bands of pale gold across the grass before the wind had even begun its daily movement across the land. Ethan Cole stood near the windmill well shortly after dawn, listening to the soft turning of the metal blades as they caught the first breeze rising from the valley. The ranch had always spoken through small sounds like that. A shifting gate hinge, the low breath of cattle across the pasture, the creak of leather against a saddle left hanging along the barn wall. These were the details that told a man how the land was feeling that day. When the army truck appeared along the distant road, its engine noise drifted clearly through the morning air, carrying across the open miles before the vehicle even reached the ranch gate. Ethan watched the dust trail rise behind it while the sun lifted higher above the horizon. The guards climbed down from the cab as usual, exchanging brief greetings before opening the rear door. Marta Keller stepped down among the others and paused again for that brief moment that had become her quiet habit. The ranch yard looked the same as it had every morning. The barn door open, the windmill turning slowly, the pasture fence stretching toward the low hills where sunlight now warmed the grass. Yet something about the air that morning felt different. The wind carried a cooler breath from the north, a sign that the season would begin shifting before long. Ethan gathered the tools and explained the work planned for the day. The cattle needed to be moved through the new gate they had built on the ridge so they could begin grazing the fresh grass that had grown after the storm. Before that could happen, the narrow trail leading up the hill had to be cleared of loose stones and broken branches left by the wind earlier in the week. It was not difficult work, but it required careful attention so the animals would move easily through the path without stumbling. The walk toward the ridge began quietly, the group following the same trail they had taken several days earlier. Marta walked near the center of the line, her eyes moving across the grass and scattered stones along the path as she studied the land the way she had gradually learned to do. The sky stretched wide and clear above them, and the breeze carried the faint scent of warm grass that had dried under the rising sun. When they reached the ridge, Ethan knelt near the path and began lifting the larger stones from the trail, setting them aside where they would not interfere with the cattle once the herd began moving. Marta worked several feet away, gathering smaller rocks and branches into a neat pile along the edge of the slope. The sound of their tools moving against the earth blended with the quiet movement of wind across the grass. After a while, Ethan noticed Marta pause again near the top of the ridge. She stood still for a moment, looking across the valley below where the ranch stretched wide beneath the morning light. From that height, the entire property looked calm and orderly. The reservoir shimmered like a small mirror in the distance. The windmill turned steadily above the barn roof. The cattle waited quietly in the lower pasture, their dark shapes scattered across the field. Ethan walked over and followed her gaze across the land. "It looks peaceful from here," he said quietly. Marta nodded. "It reminds me of the hill outside my town when I was young. From there we could see the whole valley. My father used to say that when people see the land from above, they understand that most of the troubles in the world are very small." Ethan leaned against the wooden gate post they had installed earlier that week while considering her words. He had spent his entire life working this land, yet he had rarely thought about it from that perspective. Most days he saw only the next fence that needed repairing or the next pasture that needed water. Marta looked down toward the lower pasture again, where the cattle had begun gathering near the fence line as if they already sensed the change waiting for them. "They know the gate is open now," she said softly. Ethan watched the animals for a moment before answering. Cattle always notice small changes before people do. They follow the grass and the water wherever it leads them. Marta turned slightly toward him. "People sometimes do the same thing," she replied gently. "They follow the places where life feels possible again." The remark lingered quietly between them while the breeze moved across the ridge. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The land stretched wide in every direction, calm beneath the open sky. Finally, the guards called out from farther down the trail, signaling that the path clearing was nearly finished. Ethan and Marta returned to their work, removing the final stones and smoothing the trail until it formed a clean route from the pasture below to the gate on the ridge. By early afternoon, everything was ready. Ethan opened the gate slowly and stepped aside while one of the ranch hands guided the first group of cattle toward the hill. The animals moved carefully at first, their hooves pressing into the grass while they followed the cleared path upward. When they reached the ridge, they paused briefly before passing through the new gate and spreading across the fresh pasture beyond. Marta watched the movement quietly, her hands resting lightly against the wooden post. "They look almost relieved," she said after a moment. Ethan nodded. "Fresh grass always does that. It reminds them the land still has something new to offer." Marta followed the cattle with her eyes as they moved farther into the pasture. "Perhaps people are not so different from cattle after all," she said with a faint smile. "Sometimes they simply need a new gate opened in front of them." The afternoon passed slowly after that. By the time the army truck returned, the cattle had already begun grazing across the ridge pasture, their movement calm and steady beneath the warm sun. Marta climbed into the truck with the others and took her usual seat along the wooden bench. As the vehicle rolled down the road toward the camp, she looked back once more toward the ridge where the gate now stood open against the sky. Ethan remained beside the fence line after the truck disappeared, resting his hand on the wooden post while the wind moved quietly across the hilltop. The cattle grazed peacefully beyond the gate, and the ranch stretched wide beneath the endless Texas sky. Somewhere within that quiet moment, Ethan understood that the land had been guiding more than just cattle through that gate. It had quietly opened a path neither of them had expected when the summer first began. The following morning arrived with a quieter sky than usual, the kind of stillness that sometimes settled over the Texas plains when the season itself was preparing to change. Ethan Cole noticed it before the sun had fully risen above the eastern horizon. The windmill stood nearly motionless against the pale blue sky, its metal blades turning only slightly as the early air moved slowly across the land. Late summer had begun leaning toward autumn, though the heat had not yet fully released its hold on the valley. The grass in the ridge pasture where the cattle now grazed had grown thicker during the past week, fed by the rain that had arrived exactly when the land needed it. Ethan stood beside the barn door with a tin cup of coffee in his hand, watching the long shadows stretch across the ground while the sun lifted steadily above the horizon. The ranch felt unusually calm that morning, as if the land itself were pausing between seasons. When the army truck appeared on the road, its engine sounded slightly louder in the still air. The guards stepped down as usual, exchanging brief nods before opening the rear door. Marta Keller climbed down with the others, her boots touching the ground with the same steady movement that had become familiar during the past weeks. She paused again in that quiet way of hers, letting her eyes move across the ranch yard before joining the others near the barn. Ethan noticed something new in her expression that morning. Not worry exactly. Something more thoughtful. The kind of look people carried when they knew a change was approaching but had not yet spoken about it. He gathered the tools for the day and explained the work ahead. The cattle that had been moved through the ridge gate earlier in the week had begun grazing deeper into the pasture, and one of the water troughs along the far slope needed checking to be certain the pump line had not clogged with sediment after the recent rain. The walk toward the ridge followed the same trail they had cleared only days earlier. The grass brushed lightly against their boots while the sun climbed higher above the plains. The air felt warmer than the morning before, but the wind still carried a faint coolness from the north. Marta walked quietly along the path, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the horizon where the distant hills appeared softer beneath the morning light. When they reached the ridge pasture, the cattle were already scattered across the field, their dark shapes moving slowly through the tall grass while the breeze rippled across the land. Ethan knelt beside the water trough and tested the pump handle. The metal creaked softly as water began filling the basin again, clear and steady from the underground well. Marta stepped closer and watched the thin stream gather along the bottom of the trough. The cattle will remain here for several weeks now, Ethan explained. The grass is strong enough to hold them through the next part of the season. Marta nodded while studying the quiet movement of water inside the metal basin. The land prepares itself long before people notice the change, she said softly. Ethan stood and followed her gaze across the pasture where the cattle moved slowly beneath the wide sky. That is true, he answered. A rancher learns to watch for those signs, or the land will remind him in harder ways later. Marta remained quiet for a moment before speaking again. In the camp, we sometimes hear rumors about the war ending soon. No one knows if they are true, but people talk about it more now than before. Ethan rested one hand against the wooden fence post beside the trough while considering her words. The possibility had crossed his mind more than once during the past months. News traveled slowly across rural Texas, but even distant ranches eventually heard the echoes of changes happening far away across the ocean. If the war ended, everything connected to it would begin shifting as well. Camps would close. Prisoners would return home. The routines that had quietly formed here on the ranch would dissolve as suddenly as they had begun. He looked across the pasture again before answering carefully. I suppose that day will come eventually. Marta lowered her eyes toward the grass at her feet. Yes, she said quietly. Eventually, everything returns to where it belongs. The remark carried no bitterness, only quiet acceptance. The guards called for a rest period beneath a small cluster of mesquite trees near the ridge trail. Marta sat on the ground with the others while Ethan poured water into the tin cups. The breeze moved gently across the hilltop, bending the grass into slow waves that stretched toward the horizon. For several minutes, the group remained silent, resting in the warm sunlight while the cattle grazed nearby. Marta spoke again after a while, her voice calm but thoughtful. When I first arrived here, I believed the land would feel completely foreign to me forever. Ethan looked toward the valley below before replying. And now? Marta lifted her eyes toward the distant reservoir and the windmill standing near the barn far below. Now it feels like a place that allowed me to breathe again for a little while. Ethan understood the meaning behind those words, even though she had spoken them simply. The ranch had offered something quiet during a time when most of the world had been consumed by uncertainty. A place where people worked beside each other without needing to explain every difference between them. The break ended and they returned to checking the fence along the ridge pasture, tightening a few wires where the cattle had leaned against the posts. By late afternoon, the work was finished. The cattle continued grazing peacefully beyond the fence line, their movements slow beneath the warm sunlight. When the army truck returned, Marta climbed inside with the others and took her seat along the wooden bench. Before the truck began moving, she glanced once more across the pasture and the ridge gate they had built together days earlier. Ethan stood beside the fence watching the truck roll slowly down the dirt road toward the camp. The dust rose behind it in a thin line that gradually disappeared against the distant hills. The wind moved quietly across the pasture again, and the cattle continued grazing beneath the wide Texas sky. Somewhere deep in the quiet of that late afternoon, Ethan sensed that the season of their shared work on the ranch was beginning to draw toward its end, just as the land itself had begun preparing for the next change waiting beyond the horizon. The final weeks of that summer arrived with a slower kind of sunlight, the sort that stretched longer across the Texas plains and lingered softly over the grass before evening settled in. Ethan Cole noticed the change in the mornings first. The wind carried a cooler breath from the north more often now, and the sky sometimes held thin gray clouds that drifted across the horizon without bringing rain. Autumn was still weeks away, but the land had already begun preparing itself. Quietly, the way it always did long before people realized the season had shifted. The ranch followed its familiar rhythm during those days. The cattle moved steadily across the ridge pasture where the grass remained thick from the earlier rain. The windmill turned slowly above the well near the barn. Fence lines held firm against the breeze, and the reservoir water reflected the sky like a long, narrow mirror stretching across the valley. Yet beneath that calm routine, there was a quiet understanding growing among the people who worked the land. News had begun traveling more frequently through the town beyond the hills. The war overseas was nearing its final chapter. No one knew exactly when the official announcement would arrive, but everyone could feel the change moving closer with each passing week. On the morning that change finally reached the ranch, the sky appeared unusually clear. Ethan stood beside the barn shortly after sunrise when the army truck appeared on the road earlier than usual. The vehicle slowed near the gate and stopped with a heavier sound than it normally carried. The guards climbed down and spoke briefly among themselves before opening the rear door. Marta Keller stepped down with the others, but something in her posture was different that morning. Her eyes moved across the ranch yard more slowly than usual, as if she were trying to remember every detail at once. The barn door, the windmill, the long fence stretching toward the ridge. Ethan walked toward the group and noticed that one of the guards carried a folded sheet of paper in his hand. The man cleared his throat before speaking, his voice calm but direct. Orders had arrived from headquarters during the night. The war in Europe had officially ended. Several prisoner labor assignments would be closing over the coming weeks while arrangements were made to return detainees through the proper channels. The words hung in the quiet morning air for a moment. No one spoke immediately. Even the wind seemed to pause against the grass as the meaning of the announcement settled over the small group standing in the ranch yard. Marta lowered her eyes toward the ground for a moment, absorbing the news in silence. It was the moment many people in the camp had talked about for months. The day when the war would finally release its hold on their lives. And yet, hearing the words spoken aloud felt different from the rumors that had drifted through the barracks during long nights. The guard continued explaining that the work assignments would continue only a short time longer while transportation schedules were organized. Until then, the daily routines would remain mostly the same. The ranch still required care, and the cattle still needed water and grass. Ethan listened quietly while the explanation ended. The news did not surprise him, but hearing it spoken so plainly brought a feeling he had not expected. Relief, certainly, but also something quieter. A sense that the slow rhythm of work that had shaped the past months was nearing its final chapter. Marta looked up again, and her eyes met Ethan's for a brief moment across the yard. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The meaning had already settled between them. The morning work continued that day much as it had on every other morning. The group walked toward the ridge pasture to check the fence lines where the cattle had been grazing. The sky remained wide and bright above them, and the breeze moved gently through the grass. Marta worked beside the others, tightening a loose section of wire near the gate they had built together earlier in the summer. Her movements remained steady and careful, the same way they had been since her first day on the ranch. Yet now she paused occasionally to look across the valley below. The reservoir shimmered beneath the sunlight. The windmill turned slowly near the barn roof. The entire ranch spread wide beneath the open sky like a memory already beginning to take shape. During the midday rest period beneath the mesquite trees, Marta sat quietly with the tin cup of water in her hands. Ethan stood nearby, leaning against the fence post they had repaired weeks earlier. The wind moved softly through the branches overhead, scattering small shadows across the grass. After a while, Marta spoke, her voice calm but thoughtful. "When I first arrived here, I believed every day would feel heavy because of the war." Ethan looked across the pasture where the cattle grazed slowly beneath the sun. "And now?" he asked gently. Marta lifted her eyes toward the horizon where the land stretched far beyond the ranch boundary. "Now I believe this place reminded me that the world is still larger than war." Ethan considered her words while the breeze moved across the field. "My father used to say that land has a way of teaching people things they did not know they needed to learn." Marta smiled faintly at that thought. Perhaps the land here has been a patient teacher. The afternoon passed slowly after that conversation. By the time the army truck returned, the sun had begun lowering toward the western hills, spreading long golden light across the ridge pasture. Marta climbed into the back of the truck with the others and settled onto the wooden bench one final time for that day. Before the engine started, she looked once more across the ranch where the windmill turned quietly and the cattle grazed beyond the open gate. Ethan stood near the fence watching the truck begin its slow journey down the dirt road. The dust rose behind it in a thin line that faded gradually into the evening light. The plains grew quiet again after the vehicle disappeared beyond the ridge. The cattle continued grazing peacefully beneath the wide Texas sky, and the wind moved softly across the grass as it had done for generations before the war and would continue long after it ended. Ethan remained beside the fence for several minutes, resting his hand against the wooden post they had placed together months earlier. The ranch looked exactly as it always had. The same windmill, the same pasture, the same endless sky stretching toward the horizon. Yet something within that quiet landscape had changed forever. Because for a brief season of time, while the world beyond the hills had been filled with uncertainty, two people from distant places had stood on the same land and learned the same quiet truth. The land does not ask where someone comes from. It only asks whether they are willing to care for it while they are there. And sometimes the most ordinary days, spent repairing fences beneath an open sky, become the moments that quietly reshape the direction of a life.